Some doors stay closed for 20 years until the past finally knocks. Out on the far edge of the Arizona frontier, where the dry wind carried dust across miles of empty land, there stood a lonely ranch house that most travelers barely noticed. The wood was weathered gray, the porch sagged slightly on one side, and the fence posts leaned like tired old men who had been standing too long under the sun. The man who lived there liked it that way. His name was Elias Whitmore, and for 20 years he had spoken to almost no one. Not because people never passed by. Sometimes riders crossed the distant ridge. Sometimes a wagon trail cut across the horizon. But Elias Whitmore never rode out to greet them, and no one ever stopped long enough to try. In this part of the country, people respected a man's silence, especially the kind of silence that felt heavy, like something buried deep beneath the dust. Elias had built that silence himself, board by board, year after year. Every morning he rose before sunrise, when the desert air was still cool and the sky stretched pale blue over the distant mesas. He checked the horses, repaired whatever the wind had broken overnight, and drank his coffee slowly while watching the empty plains. Days passed quietly there, weeks sometimes, the kind of quiet that settles into a man's bones until he almost forgets the sound of another voice. And for 20 long years, no one had knocked on his door. Not once. Until the night the wind changed. It started just after midnight, when the desert air turned colder and the stars above the ranch looked sharp enough to cut through the darkness. Elias was sitting by the small oil lamp inside his cabin, turning a worn army medal slowly between his fingers. The medal had faded over time, but the name engraved across its face was still clear enough to read, Elias Whitmore. He stared at it the way a man studies something he doesn't deserve to keep. Then it happened. 3 soft knocks. The sound was so unexpected that Elias didn't move at first. The knocks came again. Weak. Slow. Like someone who had traveled a long way just to reach that door. Elias stood up slowly, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots. Outside, the wind moved across the dry grass in long whispers. No horses. No wagons. Just the dark. He opened the door. A young Apache girl stood there, barely able to remain upright. Her clothes were dusty from the trail, her breathing uneven from miles of travel, and in her trembling hand, she held something that made Elias's heart stop. The same army medal he had been holding seconds before. Only this one wasn't in his hand anymore. It was in hers. The girl looked up at him, her voice no louder than the wind across the plains. "My father said you would remember this." And far out on the dark horizon, beyond the silent ranch and the empty miles of desert, the faint sound of approaching riders had already begun to rise. The girl swayed slightly in the doorway, the desert wind tugging gently at the loose strands of her dark hair, while the small medal rested in her palm, like something sacred that had traveled a very long road. Elias Whitmore stared at it without speaking, his weathered face turning pale beneath the lantern light. For 20 years he had carried the memory of that medal, and for 20 years he had hoped he would never see it again. The girl's eyes searched his face carefully, as if she had been told exactly what kind of man she would find here. Not a hero, not a soldier, just a quiet rancher who lived far away from towns, far away from people, and far away from questions about the past. The silence stretched between them until the wind shifted again across the prairie, carrying with it the faint smell of dust and distant horses. Elias finally stepped aside from the doorway. "Come in," he said quietly, his voice rough from years of little use. The girl hesitated only a moment before stepping inside the small cabin. The room was simple. A wooden table, a cast-iron stove, a narrow bed in the corner. Nothing in the room suggested that the man who lived here had ever been anything more than a rancher. And that was exactly how Elias had wanted it for 20 years. The girl sat slowly on the chair near the table while Elias closed the door behind her. The lantern light flickered across the metal in her hand. He could see it clearly now. Same worn edges. Same faded engraving. the same name that had followed him through a lifetime he had tried very hard to forget. "Where did you get that?" he asked at last. The girl held the medal carefully, as if it carried a story she had practiced telling many times. "My father kept it," she said softly. "He said one day I would bring it to you." Elias felt the air leave his lungs slowly. 20 years of quiet living had not erased the memory that now rose inside his chest. A dry canyon, a long patrol, a moment when two men from different worlds had shared the same stretch of desert sky. The girl continued speaking before he could ask another question. "My father told me your name," she said. Elias Whitmore. Hearing his own name spoken by someone who had traveled across miles of empty land felt strange, almost unreal. For years, the only voice that had spoken it had been his own thoughts. Elias moved toward the small stove and poured water from a kettle into a tin cup. He handed it to her. She accepted it with shaking hands. "He told me you once helped him," she continued. "He said you would remember." Elias looked down at the metal again, and for the first time in many years the quiet walls he had built around his past began to crack. Outside, the desert wind rolled across the open plains like a warning carried through the night. Then Elias heard it, a distant rhythm across the earth, slow at first, almost mistaken for thunder. But out here on the frontier, a man learned the difference between storms and riders. And this sound was coming closer with every passing second. The sound of distant riders rolled slowly across the desert like a storm that had not yet decided whether it would arrive or pass by. Elias Whitmore stood perfectly still beside the small wooden table, listening the way a man listens when he has spent years surviving on open land. Out here, the ground itself could speak if you paid attention long enough. The girl heard it too. Her eyes lifted toward the door, wide and alert, as if the rhythm of approaching hooves carried a meaning she already understood. Elias moved toward the window and pushed the curtain aside just enough to see the black stretch of prairie under the moonlight. Nothing yet, just empty land and pale dust glowing under the stars. But the sound was real. Horses. Several of them. Not close, but not far either. The girl tightened her grip around the tin cup he had given her. "They are coming," she said quietly. Elias did not turn around. "Who?" he asked. The girl hesitated, as though choosing her words carefully. "Men who do not want my father to speak." Elias lowered the curtain and faced her again. For a moment, he studied her the way a rancher studies a trail in the dirt, looking for signs that tell the truth beneath the surface. She was young, maybe 16 or 17, but the miles of desert dust on her clothes told a different story. She had traveled far, farther than most people would travel alone, and she had come directly to this place. "What is your father's name?" Elias asked. The girl set the metal gently on the table between them. The small piece of metal caught the lantern light and glowed softly. "Dakota," she answered. The name landed in the quiet cabin like a memory pulled out of deep water. Elias felt his chest tighten. 20 years of distance could not erase that name. Dakota had once been a scout who understood both sides of the frontier. A man who could move through desert valleys with the calm patience of someone who belonged to the land itself. Elias remembered a long ride through a canyon where the sun burned so hot the rocks looked white. He remembered running out of water miles from the nearest stream. And he remembered one man who had guided him out of that canyon when the trail had vanished into stone. Dakota. The girl watched Elias carefully, reading the silence on his face. "My father said you would remember him," she said softly. Elias nodded once, slowly. Outside, the rhythm of horses grew clearer now. The riders were still distant, but the night air carried the sound across the open plains. A man who lived alone as long as Elias Whitmore learned to measure distance by sound. Whoever those riders were, they would reach the ranch within the hour. Elias picked up the metal and turned it in his fingers again. The metal felt heavier now than it had earlier that night. "Why did he send you here?" Elias asked. The girl met his eyes. "Because he said you are the only man who still owes him a promise." The lantern flame flickered as the wind pressed against the cabin walls, and outside the desert remained wide and silent except for the steady approach of horses that were now riding straight toward the lonely ranch. The metal rested in Elias Whitmore's hand, its worn edges catching the lantern light as the sound of approaching horses slowly grew stronger across the desert night. The cabin remained quiet except for the wind brushing against the wooden walls and the steady rhythm of hooves somewhere far beyond the dark hills. Elias had spent 20 years listening to silence, but tonight the silence had finally broken. He placed the metal carefully back onto the table and looked toward the young Apache girl sitting across from him. "Your father said I owed him a promise," Elias said slowly. "What promise?" The girl watched the door as if she could already see the riders beyond it. "He said that if the day ever came when men tried to stop him from speaking the truth, there was one man who would listen." Elias let out a quiet breath and walked toward the small window again. The moon hung low above the prairie, lighting the dry grass and scattered fence posts in pale silver. Still no riders in sight, but the ground continued to whisper their approach. A man who lived this far from town learned to read distance like a clock. Whoever those riders were, they would not be turning away. Elias stepped back from the window and reached for the kettle on the stove. The girl watched him with cautious curiosity as he poured more water into the tin cup. His movements were slow and steady, the movements of someone who had spent years avoiding trouble. But there was something different in his eyes now. Something older than the quiet rancher she had expected to find. "How long have they been following you?" he asked. The girl lowered her voice. 2 days. Maybe 3. Elias nodded once. That meant the riders had patience. And patience on the frontier usually meant men who believed the land belonged to them. "Did your father send you alone?" Elias asked. The girl hesitated, then shook her head. "No. He rode with me for the first day." Elias felt the words settle heavily in the room. "And now," the girl looked down at the floorboards for a moment before answering. "Now he is somewhere behind them." The wind pressed harder against the cabin walls, making the lantern flame tremble. Elias walked back to the table and studied the metal again. For 20 years he had kept the past locked away like an old saddle hanging in a barn that no one ever opened. But tonight the desert had carried it back to his door. "Your father saved my life once," Elias said quietly. The girl lifted her eyes. "He told me." Elias nodded slowly. "And I told him that if he ever needed help, he could find me." He paused, staring at the metal as though it had finally returned to the man who deserved it. Outside, the horses were closer now. The sound of them was no longer a whisper carried by the wind. It was a steady approach across open land. Elias moved toward the door and rested his hand against the worn wood. For 20 years no one had come looking for him. But tonight the frontier had remembered his name. And somewhere out there in the moonlit desert, a group of riders was coming straight for the quiet ranch that had once been forgotten. The night air outside the ranch had grown colder, and the steady rhythm of approaching horses now carried clearly across the wide stretch of prairie. Elias Whitmore stepped onto the porch slowly, the wooden boards creaking beneath his boots as the lantern light from the cabin spilled across the dust at his feet. He stood there for a long moment, listening. The land told its story through sound. At least 6 riders. Maybe more. Not rushing. Not hiding. Just riding with the quiet certainty of men who believed they would find what they were looking for. Behind him inside the cabin, the young Apache girl remained near the table, her hands resting beside the small army medal that had traveled across miles of desert to reach this place. Elias could feel the weight of the past pressing against his thoughts, the kind of weight a man carries even after years of silence. 20 years earlier, he had ridden through these lands wearing a different life, one that followed orders, tracked trails, and believed that the frontier was simple. But the frontier had never been simple. It was a land of promises made in quiet moments and debts that returned when a man least expected them. Elias stepped back inside the cabin and closed the door gently behind him. The girl looked up as he entered, her eyes steady despite the growing sound of riders outside. "They are close now," she said. Elias nodded. "Yes." He walked to the table and picked up the metal again, turning it slowly beneath the lantern flame. "Your father kept this all these years?" The girl answered softly. "He said it belonged to the man who once stood beside him under the same sky." Elias studied the metal for another second before placing it back in front of her. "No," he said quietly. "It belonged to him." The girl looked surprised, but she did not argue. Outside, the horses were now close enough that their movement stirred faint clouds of dust along the distant fence line. Elias moved toward the window and looked out across the dark prairie. In the pale moonlight, he could finally see them. Riders forming a long line across the open land, their silhouettes rising and falling as their horses moved steadily forward. The desert wind carried their presence like a slow drumbeat across the ranch. Elias watched them carefully. Men like that did not ride through the night for no reason. He stepped away from the window and faced the girl again. "You said your father wants the truth to be heard," Elias said. The girl nodded. "Yes." Elias rested his hand on the edge of the table, the worn wood smooth beneath his fingers from years of quiet living. "Then tonight may be the night that promise returns." The riders continued their slow approach under the moonlight, and for the first time in 20 years the lonely ranch no longer felt forgotten by the world beyond the desert. The riders reached the outer fence just before the moon climbed high above the desert ridge, their horses slowing to a steady walk as dust drifted quietly across the open ground. Elias Whitmore stepped out onto the porch again, the night air cool against his face while the lantern behind him cast a long shadow across the wooden boards. For 20 years he had lived with the kind of quiet that made a man invisible to the world, but tonight the world had finally found its way back to his door. The riders stopped about 50 yards from the ranch house, their shapes dark against the pale prairie. None of them rushed forward. Men who rode with patience rarely needed to raise their voices. One rider guided his horse a few steps ahead of the others. His coat was long and dark, and the silver badge pinned to it caught a faint line of moonlight. "Evening, Mr. Whitmore," the man called out calmly. Elias did not move from the porch. Hearing his own name spoken across the open land after so many silent years felt like hearing a voice from another lifetime. "Evening," Elias replied. The rider studied the ranch house carefully, his eyes passing over the weathered boards, the small window, and the quiet barn standing off to the side. "We have been following a young traveler across these plains," the man continued. "Our trail seems to end near your property." Elias rested one hand on the porch railing. The wood was smooth beneath his fingers, worn by seasons of wind and sun. "A lot of trails pass through this country," Elias said evenly. The rider gave a small nod, as if he had expected that answer. "That may be true," he said, "but some trails carry more importance than others." Behind Elias, the cabin remained silent. The Apache girl had not moved from the table. She understood the rhythm of these conversations just as well as Elias did. On the frontier, the most dangerous words were often spoken in the calmest voices. The rider shifted slightly in the saddle and looked past Elias toward the open land beyond the ranch. "We are looking for a message," the man said, "something that should not reach certain ears." Elias studied the group of riders again. Their horses were strong and well cared for, their saddles carrying the kind of gear that belonged to men who traveled long distances with purpose. These were not careless men wandering the frontier. These were men sent to finish a task. "You rode a long way for a message," Elias replied. The rider's expression remained calm beneath the brim of his hat. "Sometimes words can change the future of a territory," he said quietly. The desert wind moved through the dry grass around the ranch, carrying the smell of dust and distant mountains. Elias felt the weight of the metal still resting on the table behind him inside the cabin. A promise made under a hot canyon sun 20 years earlier had finally returned to the surface of the land. The rider looked up toward Elias once more. If someone came here tonight, he said carefully, it would be best for everyone if we continued our journey together. Elias Whitmore stood on the porch of the lonely ranch and looked out across the line of waiting riders. And for the first time in 20 years, he knew that the quiet life he had built beneath the desert sky had finally reached the moment it had been waiting for. The night air remained still after the rider finished speaking, as if even the desert itself was waiting to hear what Elias Whitmore would say next. The lantern behind him flickered softly through the cabin window, throwing warm light across the porch while the riders waited in quiet patience beyond the fence line. Elias rested both hands on the porch railing and looked across the open prairie. 20 years earlier, he had stood on land like this, wearing a different life, following orders that had once seemed simple. Now the same wide desert stretched before him again. Only this time the choice belonged to him alone. The lead rider guided his horse one step closer, the leather saddle creaking quietly. "You have lived out here a long time, Mr. Whitmore," the man said in a calm voice. "Long enough to understand that some matters travel farther than a man intends." Elias gave a small nod. "That is true." The rider studied him carefully. "Then you understand why we cannot allow certain words to reach the wrong people." Elias remained silent for a moment, listening to the wind brush through the dry grass around the ranch. Behind him inside the cabin, the young Apache girl sat quietly near the table, the metal resting beside her hand. She could hear every word spoken on the porch, though she made no sound. The rider shifted his weight slightly in the saddle and glanced toward the cabin door. "If the traveler we seek is here," he continued, "it would be easier for everyone if the journey ended peacefully tonight." Elias Whitmore slowly straightened from the railing and stepped forward one pace across the porch boards. His boots made a quiet sound against the wood. For 20 years he had avoided conversations like this, the kind where the future of a promise stood balanced between two men beneath the same sky. "You rode a long way for peace," Elias said evenly. The rider allowed himself a thin smile. "Peace often requires effort." The horses behind him shifted quietly in the dust, their breath drifting into the cool desert air. Elias looked past the riders toward the open horizon where the moon hung above distant ridges. He thought of the long canyon trail 20 years ago, the day a man named Takota had guided him safely through land that could easily have swallowed a stranger. Out here, a promise was not something a man forgot. The rider spoke again, his voice steady and patient. "You have lived quietly, Mr. Whitmore. It would be unfortunate if that quiet life ended tonight over something that does not belong to you." Elias turned his head slightly toward the cabin behind him. Through the window, he could see the faint outline of the girl sitting at the table, a messenger carrying her father's trust across miles of empty desert. He faced the riders again. "You are right about one thing," Elias said calmly. "Some things do not belong to me." The rider leaned forward in the saddle, waiting. Elias Whitmore lifted his chin slightly beneath the lantern light and spoke the words that had waited 20 years to return. "But a promise still does." The wind moved across the ranch again, and for the first time that night the quiet desert felt as though it was listening to what would happen next. The desert wind moved quietly across the ranch after Elias Whitmore spoke those words, carrying dust along the fence posts and whispering through the dry grass like an old story the land had heard before. The riders did not move at first. Their horses shifted beneath them, hooves pressing gently into the pale soil while the moonlight stretched long shadows across the open ground. The man with the silver badge studied Elias carefully from the saddle, his expression calm but thoughtful, as though weighing the meaning of a promise spoken after 20 silent years. "A promise," the rider repeated slowly. "Those can be dangerous things out here." Elias Whitmore did not step back from the porch. The lantern behind him cast a warm glow over the worn boards and the quiet door of the cabin. Inside, the Apache girl remained near the table, her hands resting beside the metal that had traveled farther than any message should have needed to travel. She listened to every word spoken outside, her breath steady despite the riders gathered beyond the fence line. Elias looked across the prairie toward the men waiting in the dust. "Some promises are," he said calmly. "Others simply wait their turn." The rider tilted his head slightly, as if the answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "And you believe this one is worth the trouble?" he asked. Elias rested his hand again on the porch railing, feeling the smooth wood beneath his fingers. For years that railing had been part of the quiet life he had built, a life where days passed without questions and nights passed without riders crossing the plains. Tonight that quiet had ended, and there was no reason left to pretend otherwise. "I believe a man should keep the words he gives," Elias said. The rider glanced briefly toward the cabin door, then back toward Elias. Even when those words place him between other men and their work. Elias did not answer right away. Instead, he looked beyond the riders toward the distant horizon where the moonlight brushed across the tops of the hills. The desert was wide enough to hold many kinds of truth, and the land itself rarely rushed a man to speak. Then something changed in the night air. At first, it was only a faint tremor beneath the quiet wind, a distant movement so soft it might have been mistaken for thunder rolling across the far valleys. Elias noticed it before the riders did. A man who had lived alone this long learned to hear the ground before others felt it. The lead rider shifted slightly in his saddle as the sound slowly grew clearer. More horses, many more, not approaching quickly, but moving with a steady rhythm across the open land beyond the ridge. The rider turned his head toward the dark horizon, his calm expression tightening for the first time. Elias Whitmore watched the distant prairie and understood what the desert was about to reveal. Somewhere beyond the hills, under the same wide sky, another group of riders was crossing the land, and they were riding straight toward the lonely ranch. The distant tremor across the desert grew stronger with every passing second, rolling through the quiet prairie like a slow heartbeat rising from the earth itself. The riders near the fence line felt it now. Their horses lifted their heads and shifted uneasily, ears turning toward the dark ridge beyond the ranch. The man with the silver badge narrowed his eyes toward the horizon where the moonlight brushed across the tops of the hills. "You were expecting someone else," he said quietly. Elias Whitmore remained still on the porch, the lantern light glowing behind him as the desert wind carried the approaching sound closer. "No," Elias answered calmly. "But the land remembers its own people." The rhythm of hooves grew clearer, no longer distant enough to mistake. Many riders, far more than the small group waiting outside the ranch. The men near the fence turned in their saddles, watching the ridge line carefully as shapes began to appear against the pale sky. One rider, then another, then a long line stretching across the crest of the hill like a silent wave rolling across the desert. The wind carried with it the faint movement of feathers and leather, the quiet sound of horses that knew the land beneath their feet. The man with the badge said nothing for a moment. Even from a distance, he could see the riders forming across the ridge, their silhouettes steady and patient beneath the moonlight. The desert had shifted. The balance of the night was no longer the same. Elias Whitmore stepped down from the porch and onto the dry ground beside the house. The dust settled around his boots as he looked toward the ridge. 20 years earlier, he had stood beside a man named Dakota under a different stretch of sky, when the frontier had seemed endless and the future had felt far away. Now that same future had arrived at his quiet ranch. The line of riders on the hill slowly descended toward the open prairie, their movement calm and measured. They did not rush. They did not shout. They simply rode together beneath the moonlight until the distance between them and the ranch closed enough for the lead rider to be seen clearly. The man guiding that horse sat tall in the saddle, his presence steady as the desert wind moved through his long dark hair. Elias Whitmore felt the years fall away the moment he recognized him. "Dakota," The Apache rider guided his horse forward until he stopped several yards away from the ranch, his eyes moving from Elias to the group of men gathered near the fence. No one spoke at first. The night air held the silence like something sacred. Finally, Dakota looked toward Elias and gave a small nod, the kind of greeting two men share when words are no longer necessary. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the worn army medal. He walked a few steps forward across the dust and held it out. Dakota accepted it quietly, turning the medal in his hand before looking back toward Elias. "You kept your word," Dakota said. Elias Whitmore glanced back toward the cabin where the young girl still waited safely inside. Then he looked across the wide desert that had once held 20 years of silence. "Some promises just take time," he replied. The wind moved across the prairie once more, carrying the sound of many horses standing together beneath the moon, and for the first time in 2 decades the lonely ranch no longer stood alone beneath the western sky.